Hi, everyone. Welcome to session 7. We're sort of in the home stretch. Um, 3 more online weeks and then in person. So I hope everyone's projects are going super well. Today we are going to talk about LGBTQ students. Um, I wanted to just give a quick note on language first. You've probably noticed that I do tend to use the word queer. I am part of the queer community, and it's a word that I am comfortable with. It is a word that I use for myself and many other people use for themselves. If you are not part of the LGBTQ community, it's worth just checking before you use it with people if that's the word they use, if it's not the word they use. Um, so sometimes during this training, I will probably say LGBTQ, LGBTQIA, and sometimes I will probably say queer and trans, mostly because it's faster and there's no way to actually get the entire alphabet in there, right? So we'll talk a little about definitions, but I just wanted to put that out there. So first I wanted to do just a little bit of basics before we really get into some of this is the beginning of this is sort of an LGBTQ 101, just so that we can do the rest of the work. I I'm going to try to move through things pretty quickly, but it's really hard to move much forward from here if we don't have a common background. So, sexual orientation and gender identity are different. I know most of us know this, but it's actually a pretty complicated concept that people still get a little stuck in. So, some examples of sexual orientations: lesbian, bisexual, gay, asexual, sexual orientations. Um, Gender identities: man, woman, non binary, genderqueer, agender. Men and women can be transgender or cisgender. Cisgender means that you identify with the gender you were assigned at birth. So, for example, I'm cisgender. Was when I was born, they were like, it's a girl. And so I was assigned female at birth, and I identify as a woman. Um, Lesbians, bisexual, gay people, and asexual people can be transgender or cisgender. So I know cisgender lesbians who were assigned female at birth and are women and are attracted to other women. I know trans lesbians who were assigned male at birth and are women and are attracted to other women. People of any gender can have any sexual orientation. People of any gender and any sexual orientation can express those identities in a wide range of ways. And this next point is in bold because I really want to drive it home. You don't have to understand what's going on with someone. It's fine. I don't always. No one I know does always, including a lot of other LGBTQ educators. Everyone is different, but it doesn't matter whether you understand it, really, is what it comes down to. It's still real, it's still that person's experience, it's still valid, and it still needs to be treated as real and valid, right? Like, it's cool if we understand things, but it's beside the point. So, just quickly, I wanted to just go over gender identity, gender expression and presentation, just a few different terms about the sex and gender binary. So, gender identity is an internal sense of being male, female, neither, both, something else, and everyone has a gender identity, whether you're cis or trans, um, like I talked about in the last one. And what your identity is and your expression aren't necessarily the same. So, gender expression and presentation is sort of what you look like, right? So, clothing, hairstyle, voice, body shape, all of those things. Most people who are trans work to make their gender expression, match their gender identity versus their sex assigned at birth. So, like if someone was a trans woman, she is a woman when she was born, she was assigned male. She's a woman now, so for the most part, a trans woman is going to have a gender expression that matches that. She's going to have a gender expression similar to a lot of women. Sex assigned at birth is what someone is assigned based on male, female, intersex, something else based on anatomy, hormones, and chromosomes. Um, Chromosomes don't determine genitalia. There's all sorts of, if I'm this is not even stuff I'm going to put into our resource guide because let's not get in the weeds, but feel free to Google whatever you want around the amazing array of like chromosomal options and genital options and all of that. Like it's just not as like cut and dry and binary as we like to act. Sexually attracted to, sexual orientation, um, those can be from a variety of factors. Romantically attracted to, sometimes that doesn't line up with sexually attracted to, especially for people that might be asexual but homo-romantic or hetero-romantic. Um, it's okay. We don't need to understand all of it. We don't need to like get deep into it, but just recognize that all of these things, gender identity, gender expression, sex assigned at birth, sexually attracted to, romantically attracted to, um, those things are all can be independent from each other, right? Nothing necessarily lines up. These are not actually binary, but we can't ignore the fact that we live in a culture that makes things pretty binary and that not conforming to that is a really real impact on people. Definitions. My God, these are always changing. There's a list here. I'm not going to go through them all. It's helpful to have a list so you can be conversant with things. This one that I'm linking you to, which is at University of Florida, I believe, they update it pretty regularly. So I just keep using this one because then you can always just like check some stuff out. It's got some really old ones that most people aren't using as much anymore, but it's also got some newer ones. Um, so I think it tries very hard to be comprehensive, and also less white centric than a lot of other resources have been. So I just wanted to quickly talk about transphobia in the world because it's a thing that impacts within our schools as well. So there's employment discrimination, harassment in schools, family rejection, healthcare disparities. And I just love this little image um, because I feel like when people find out that people are trans, like, people assume they know who's trans and who isn't by looking at them, which is generally not accurate, right? Like, whether you're saying it to be supportive or to be transphobic, it's just generally wrong. Um, and so I like this idea that you just met someone, you didn't ask about their genitals, so how would you know if they're trans, right? Like, and genitals don't tell you whether someone is trans, but it's this question of like the idea that we can like glance at someone and have some knowledge or background. So, all of that, I flew through that in 8 minutes. If there's questions, feel free to contact me. I just sort of really wanted to get into why this matters. Not what matters, but like how does this inequity actually impact our students and our schools? So there's this um, CDC study, the CDC Youth Risk Behavior Study. I honestly, like when I was going through this, it was really depressing. And this could just be my own positionality, and I own that. Um, but if this is a lot, I totally respect people needing to pause this and do whatever it takes because I see how much change there has been and how much more space we have made for LGBTQ people and LGBTQ youth in particular. And so when I read this, it still stuns me, honestly. So this study is from 2015. Um, they've only recently sort of started really collating good data on lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth is all they're looking at in this. There's no trans youth. Um, so to me, what is notable about this is how cross context and holistic this increased risk is. So for LGB youth, lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth, this study shows higher rates of not wearing a seatbelt, for bisexual youth also not wearing bike helmets, riding with drunk drivers, driving drunk, carrying a weapon, carrying a gun, being in a physical fight, being injured in a fight, being threatened or injured with a weapon on school property, 5 times higher rates of not going to school because they felt unsafe on school property, higher rates of being survivors of dating violence, 3 times higher rates of being forced to have sexual intercourse, feeling sad or hopeless, super, super high rates for bisexual kids. Considering planning or attempting suicides at 4 times higher rates, treated for suicide attempts at 6 times higher rates. Every single thing you could think around substance use, everything, so much higher. Injecting drugs at 10 times higher rates. Smoking more and earlier and more things, and using drugs at school, and all of this. I think that this next one is one of the things that is most intense to me. So, um, higher rates of sex, sex before 13, sex with 4 or more people, not using a condom, not using birth control, drinking before sex. These are disproportionate based on someone's stated identity as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, not their practice. When you look at practice of people having same-sex sex, or however you want to define it, heterosexual sex, however you want to define that, and both, there is no difference. But when you look at how people identify themselves, that's where you see these distinctions. Didn't eat enough, didn't eat enough fruit and vegetables, didn't eat for 24 hours, took diet pills, vomited, took laxatives. All of these are higher rates. And for bisexual students, it's a particularly higher risk. So to me, why this matters is because what we are seeing is that LGBT teens are risking their lives in every way we can see more recklessly than their heterosexual peers. Um, so there's only a little information about stigma. I mean, to me, I feel like we read between the lines and we see stigma, but there's actually been some specific research. So for young trans women of color, they have a 22% HIV infection rate. General population infection rate is 0.6. So that is a 36 times higher rate. Um, and so they're talking about how stigma can create stressors that supersede the ability of an individual to cope with his or her circumstances. So, whatever else it would look like, if we have this stigma, it makes it so much more of an uphill battle. Um, so, they make up what's known as the HIV risk environment because they affect HIV risk behavior that significantly. Something that people don't think about as often, in far of what I've seen, is the super high rates of teen pregnancy among lesbian and bisexual teens. So 2 to 7 times the rates of heterosexual peers. Some of this happened in a study actually in Massachusetts. There's a link to it at the bottom. But so they're also significantly more likely to report discrimination and harassment than lesbian and bisexual teens who have never been pregnant. So that also speaks to some unique risk factors for sexual minority youth about stigma and exclusion. And there's hypotheses about why in particular this is, that maybe because there's not appropriate focused targeted sexual education, that lesbian and bisexual youth aren't necessarily engaging as much with the general curriculum, possibly because people are trying to not be gay, possibly because people are really trying to figure things out and have so much that's going on and so much around stigma that they're not able to sort of like process what safety could look like, possibly because of this earlier sex, more likely to have higher risk sex that we talked about on the previous slide. And so this is talking again about how to reduce rates of teen pregnancy, we have to look at reducing stigma and sexual violence towards LGBT youth, which um, involves schools and involves the community and involves looking at teen dating violence in general, and harassment. And so stigma plays a huge role in safety in life. Just to keep going with the terrible news, the National Trans Discrimination Survey looks at that those who expressed uh, trans identity or identified and um, showed an expression of being gender nonconforming, while in K 12 had these drastic rates of harassment, physical assault, sexual violence. Almost a sixth of them left school either in K 12 or higher education because of the intensity of harassment. Teachers were harassing the students. Almost a third of the students reported harassments by teachers and staff. And then 5% physical assault by teachers and staff, and 3% sexual assault by teachers and staff. Students of color, higher rates of harassment and violence across the board. Trans girls reporting higher rates of violence. Trans men and gender nonconforming students, higher rates of harassment and bullying. And this part gets me every time I read it. So, experience of mistreatment in school correlated with lower income levels. Those who reported mistreatment in school were 50% less likely to earn $50,000 a year than the general population. Those who said they were physically assaulted at school due to gender identity and expression were twice as likely to have worked in the underground economy, including sex work, and 50% more likely to be incarcerated. Nearly half who left school due to harassment, which, as we know, is almost a sixth of these students, reported having experienced homelessness. So it really matters, like figuring out how to make schools um, safe and competent for queer and trans youth is hugely important. Um, there's a nursing study about acceptance also. Um, so this I think is really interesting. Um, so they talked to a bunch of youth, LGBT youth, um, about sort of how they felt accepted and rejected around their queer identities. And so if you had a lot of rejecting reactions, it increased your risk of substance abuse and substance use. But if you also had accepting and positive reactions, it buffered that. It didn't make it so that you weren't going to, but it reduced the likelihood down to a lower um, number. So I think that also speaks to how huge it is to have schools being appropriately accepting. So just pause for a minute, and I'd love it if you could just watch this video with just a couple of students. It's just like less than 3 minutes, just talking about what they want you to know. Okay, pause it. I'm going to go on to the next slide. Did you pause it? Great. Okay. So now that you're back, I just wanted to talk a little, since we're talking about school culture and we're talking about equity, I want to talk about staff again. And here I want to talk specifically about the importance of having a school environment that makes it possible for LGBTQ adults, teachers, other staff, administrators to be able to be out. And so there's this Adrienne Rich quote that I really value that says, "When those who have the power to name and socially construct reality choose not to see you or hear you, Whether you're dark skinned, old, disabled, female, or speak with a different accent or dialect than theirs, when someone with the authority of a teacher, say, describes the world and you are not in it, there is a moment of psychic disequilibrium, as if you looked into a mirror and saw nothing. So, the CDC has some strategies for increasing school connectedness. It's very hard to make them look good on a graph because I just stole theirs. Um, so basically, it's a whole range of elements that includes being able to make decisions, to connect to peers, to connect to adults, to have trusting and caring relationships, and to provide support for teachers to be able to help them meet the diverse cognitive, emotional, and social needs of children and adolescents, assessed according to their qualifications. And there's more resources at that website. I'll try to add that to our resource guide. Um, so I also want to just talk for a second about outness, creating an environment where students can be out. I think that it's less now than it used to be, but sometimes students can be told, especially younger students, that they should just like wait a while to figure out if what they're saying is real because it's going to be such a hard go for them to come out. And so this research from the American Journal of Community Psychology notes that outness was related to higher victimization, but also higher self-esteem and lower depression. Greater victimization was related to negative academic outcomes directly and indirectly via diminished well-being. The increases of victimization associated with outness were larger for rural youth, and benefits to their well-being partly compensated for their lower well-being overall. So being out reflects resilience in the face of higher risk of victimization and promotes well-being in other ways. So creating an environment that can support students to be out can be huge in terms of them being able to basically become full and thorough. So there's a lot of places that gender and sexuality come up at schools, and I feel like sometimes we get a little focused on the bathroom. And so what I want is for you to write and send me a reflection about 8 other places that are not bathrooms where gender and sexuality might come up at your school. So go ahead and pause this, and when you're done, move on. My God, sorry, going back and forth on that can really increase students' uh, sense of the school as a place where they can have resilience. Anti-bullying support starting and expanding from the classroom, including LGBTQ positive messaging throughout the room and in classroom agreements. Again, not making the gendered parent assumptions. Built-in preferred name and pronoun times in classes. I think sometimes this works, sometimes this doesn't work, and it's really about knowing the class, whether it makes sense to go around and when everyone's introducing themselves, do you want to have everyone go around and say their names? Or if you have an about me that you have the students fill out at the beginning of the year, you can add pronouns and preferred names on that. Challenging heterosexism in assignments, visually representing queer and trans people in offices, school-wide, making sure your dress code isn't gendered, making sure your graduation outfits aren't gendered, all of that. Having a clear and detailed bullying policy that names LGBTQ communities as protected and also intentionally, explicitly supports queer and trans staff in their decisions to be out or not out. Just to be clear, a staff being out to some people doesn't necessarily mean that they want to be out or open about trans status to students. So just being careful on that. There have been studies that show that a GSA can be highly protective, especially for trans students. They are more likely to, even if they do not access the GSA themselves, to identify it as a protective factor in their school environment. Gender-neutral bathroom options both in and out of school, and allowing children to use bathrooms that align with their identity, not being policed, not being forced to go to a different bathroom because they're choosing to use one that doesn't align with one that aligns with their identity but not their birth assignment, not making kids use gender-neutral bathrooms because of that. Having policies and procedures regarding challenges to books and curricula. So I'm from Indiana, said that before. Um, and there is currently a bill that just recently passed that was going to make it so that teachers couldn't mention LGBTQ people without a written parent permission slip. Thank God we're in Massachusetts, right? But still, you may end up getting challenges to books and materials from parents. And so just making sure that there's a clear policy for how that goes. Professional development for staff about queer and trans competence, parent forms that don't make gender assumptions, student information and record system that leaves space for trans and non-binary students. Looking at your sex segregated sport and locker rooms, seeing what's really necessary and what you can do to really be supporting trans students and non-binary students in those situations. Making sure that queer and trans people are part of who comes to talk in your school and not just as queer and trans people. You're going to have a dentist come and maybe you can find an openly queer trans dentist, I don't know. Whatever work makes sense. Comprehensive health education that also covers LGBTQ specific health concerns. Queer and trans materials in libraries and accessible on computers. Some of the web filters automatically filter out material about LGBTQ specific information. For some students, this will be the only place they're able to get this information, so making sure that it's accessible. Um, and you can also undertake your own school climate study. If you click through this, I'll also put a link up. Listen has this pretty amazing template that you can personalize to your school. Um, and again, when supports specifically include trans youth, the impact is greater on their well-being than it is for cis LGBT or cis LGBT youth. So just knowing that being clear about trans people mattering makes a huge, huge difference in the lives of trans people in your school.